Hey y'all, hope everything's okay. Just wanted to drop me a quick 20-minute video or so. Just thinking about what we talked about in my video the other day, looking at Public Enemy from a black nationalist, sort of Afrocentric perspective. I think that's going to be important, especially since we're not going to necessarily spend a whole bunch of time talking about Afrocentricity or black nationalism as a political construct or as even a philosophical construct, but I'll make reference to it here in a second. But so yes, I just kind of want to make sure that I talk a little bit about it right now. I'm just understanding that, especially black nationalism and Afrocentricity and hip hop. We think early on, obviously, we think about like KRS-One, and obviously who we're talking about in Public Enemy, right? KRS-One, right? Literally KRS-One, right? Knowledge reigns supreme, right? That's what KRS stands for, and he's known as the teacher, right? Talked about the fifth element of hip hop being knowledge, right? So a lot of you probably know that already. It also was brought up in the first chapter of my book that you read earlier in the semester, right? So, um, but when you think about black nationalism as a political construct or as a philosophical construct, right, that talks about politics, you're talking about the ways in which we, black America, see the world and see the world relationship up against sort of white dominant structures, right? Black nationalism was a 19th century kind of theory that moved into the 20th century that obviously is waned off a lot, especially during the civil rights era and stuff like that, right? Folk like Marcus Garvey in the 20th century brought it forward, but you have a lot of people before, like Martin Delany and others in the 1800s, who talked a lot about black people being kind of self-sufficient, autonomous, right? Realizing that they need to be separate, right? Black nationalism, black nation building, right? Need to be separated, right? Marcus Garvey comes in, talks about the Back to Africa movement in the early 1900s, and then obviously Garvey influenced, as I mentioned in the last video, uh, Farrar Muhammad, Farrar Muhammad, Elijah Muhammad, Malcolm X, Farrakhan, that trajectory, right? But in hip hop, right, we're thinking about two main people, KRS-One and Public Enemy, and they were kind of more known as being vocal advocates for the issues related to social environments, right? So we talked about the social environments, but we talked about it a lot from a sort of a gangster rap kind of perspective, right? But here we're going to be more a little bit in terms of social consciousness perspective, right? But gangster rap, as you know, and black nationalism kind of comes among it around the same time, right? But the reality is that um, people like African Bambaataa, who was involved in especially 5% Nation, which is a spinoff, if you will, of sort of black Muslims. But the 5%ers, the Hebrew Israelites, really, which is a whole different conversation. If you want a video about Hebrew Israelites and hip hop or 5%ers, a lot of those in hip hop, please tell me, email me. I'll do another video. It'd be fun for you guys to think about for those who are interested. I know others really aren't interested, but if you are interested, I'll do a video, no problem. But yeah, but like African Bambaataa would say things like, before they was really teaching, right? You had, in terms of the teaching of nationalism, right? You had hip hop, right? So you had a Public Enemy, right? You had then in the gangster rap, if you will, you had people like NWA, right? Straight Outta Compton, right? That kind of stuff, right? Uh, but and so those become important kind of goalposts in terms of how we think about nationalism and Afrocentricity from a political perspective, but to better kind of understand the environment of the social consciousness of phenomenology, we kind of want to step into the 80s, right, and think about Reaganomics, right? I mean, this is what a lot of these rappers were kind of responding to, the Reagan era, right? Obviously, this precedes you, but you all know Ronald Reagan. Um, the idea that the 80s were kind of this upper America, a celebration of wealth, the richest third of the nation. This idea of sort of popularized sort of segregation in economics, Reaganomics, right, becomes a part of the regular nomenclature, right? Trickle down economic theory, right? Rising tides floats all boats, kind of stuff, right? That's the kind of conversation. Tax cuts for the wealthy, big business, that kind of thing, right? And the question would those help the rising tide? Would that help poor people? And what he became, or what is, of the black underclass, as well as urban underclass, as opposed to suburban America, becomes a very, very important conversation post Ronald, well, during Reagan, and then of course post Reagan, which is when we have these artists who are coming through having these conversations, right? So KRS One's big big group was, right, Boogie Down Productions, right, and BDP was an important, an important rap group of the late 80s, after the Reagan era. Big in his conversations with Boogie Down Productions, he always talks about examining the institutions, right, the laws, right, talking about incarceration, the war on drugs, right? That was Nancy Reagan's thing, right? Crack cocaine, the disparities in terms of 10 to 1, right? Crack gets 10 times as much time as pure cocaine, right? Another kind of thought in the 80s and 90s that this was black versus white, a racial kind of judicial construct put forth, right? And so KRS-One, and his album By Any Means Necessary, right, becomes an important consciousness album. So if you ever have time to look at that, look up By Any Means Necessary, and and KRS-One, right? But within this same construct, let me kind of hit this and move on. Within the same construct, right, which is this Reagan sort of ultra conservative kind of construct, you also had the album that we're talking about this week, which is Public Enemies. It Takes a Nation of Millions to Hold Us Back, right? Came out in '88. A lot of people were scared of the album, right? I mean, you think about, you know, the idea of what you remember. I told you Chuck D, Flavor Flav, right? But Terminator X, all the people, right? So, but what this album did was demand authority within sort of social commentary that was really, kind of the sort of the soundboard of those of us who are going to college that next year. I went in '89, right? But it was an attack, right? It was just like a right? It was loud. It was public. It was just like, listen, you know, black people and conscious black people, going back to again 5% Nation, that 5%, right? The conscious black people are going to really turn up America, right? And so the Nation of Millions album is a sort of attack, right? From really from the beginning to the end, right? Look at the album cover, right? I know you listen to it online. You don't have the album cover, but find the album cover. Look at it. You'll see the picture of Chuck D and Flavor Flav right behind a Public Enemy logo and a gun scope, right? And so this idea that this sort of attention on mass incarceration, right? And at this time, there's sort of the growth of mass incarceration, basically through the Reagan era. Nancy Reagan's war on drugs grew exponentially, like 3 times as much in like 5 to 6 years, right? Part of that was talked about in your video that you saw on Crips and Bloods, right? A little bit. We talked about that, right? Um, and so you also hear, as I mentioned in the last video, you also hear the voice of Louis Farrakhan in the video a lot, right? Proclaiming the teacher of the teachings of the Nation of Islam, and he was one of the sort of most prevalent black leaders, especially of the 80s, within that tradition that we talked about, right? The Malcolm X, Garvey, Farah Muhammad kind of background, right? And so, the Nation of Millions album, I don't think it necessarily opened a dialogue between sort of black and white America, but I certainly think it sort of created some angst, right? And so I do know from the professor is going to be lecturing Wednesday, I do know that one of the songs she's going to talk about is Party for Your Right to Fight, right? And so there's this line in there that says, how to go, is line there that says, then at the hour of 12, some force uh, cut the power and emerged from hell. It was just so-called government that made this happen, just like the devils that they were, something like that. You'll see that if you're doing that. Look at that party for your right to fight, right? Um, Again, you see that's a spinoff, right? Those of you who know the Beastie Boys or already heard of them, they had a big song back then called "Fight for Your Right to Party," right? You gotta fight for your right, right? To part, right? And so Public Enemy flips that around a little bit, right? And he calls the government devils, right? Which again is sort of this language of the Nation of Islam, which comes from the nation of Hebrew Israelites, talking about this sort of white men as being crafted devils, if you will, right? Um, but I think that he even talks about in one of the songs, I forget the song, "A Rebel Without a Pause," right? And if you listen to that one, he says something about the president, impeach the president, right? Or, pulling out the ray gun, right? About Reagan, right? But the Tommy Ray gun is a gun, right? So it's interesting, right? Again, this is him talking, right? This is before After Police, right? This is why this becomes such an important album. Hate it or love it, it just stirred a lot of attention, right? And the idea of them just putting it straight to the face of America, especially the political establishment, right? There's another song I think you should pay attention to, Night of the Living Bassheads, right? Which is this conversation about like free cocaine. I mean free base cocaine, which again, if you think about rock, rock to the planet rock, don't stop, right? This idea of cocaine as being an important in party culture and party scenes of the 70s and 80s. But then, like I said, this political move between crack cocaine and pure cocaine was something that was being done. My favorite song of the album is Black Steel, right? Our Chaos. I think that's kind of one of my favorite conversation. And, this idea of I got a letter, this idea of drafting, right? Drafting to the army, right? America had never gave a damn about me, right? That kind of thing. And so why would I serve in a war kind of conversation, right? And so he doesn't believe that army recruitment is something that black people should ever get into under a white structured government that continues to bombard black America and urban black spaces, right? So again, he unapologetic. Chuck D comes hard in this album. And I'm just not sure what our professor is going to do Wednesday. Just I talked to you a little bit, as I said, and I want to make sure this is in your back of your mind to do your pre-writes because you just got to understand that really I'd be curious to know what Chuck D would think about Kelly Dillon really responding to the album. So this is going to be interesting. And I'm excited about it because I love Kelly Dillon. She is our director of diversity with faculty. She's certainly engaged and involved. She cares. But Public Enemy is highly critical. And again, they are separatists of a certain level. So it's interesting. But Chuck D's call for kind of justice and truth is a sort of black nationalist way. Was kind of the first time it really appeared, or at least not first time, I'm sure, but before, but a potent time, a very important time within our communities, right? I mean, Marvin Gaye, of the '60s, Gil Scott Heron, the revolution will not be televised, right? You should take a look at that if you ever want to do some little searching on music. Gil Scott Heron, Marvin Gaye, what's going on? What's going on? That kind of stuff, right? These two are political conversations, right? So again, that's kind of what you're going to be seeing here in this album, and so hopefully you'll like it. Hopefully you'll find, um, you know, this is an important album. You will see the importance of the album that it truly is, and you'll just recognize that this album was more than just politics. It was really a kind of a you know, to white America, and especially white political America. Not all white kids, not all white America. They love white kids who were being sort of countercultural and f the police too, right? But they were like, f this, to the political establishment, right? To sort of the separation politics. And it was, and quite frankly, it was a big diss to black people too. Those conservative black people who just wanted to go move to the suburbs and get away from black people, right? The ones that would say things like, "Oh, those N words over there," right? We don't deal with them, right? So it was a sort of this really a fu to everybody, right? Who isn't down with the cause of the liberation of black people, right? Which is how you see the influence, especially of people like Malcolm X and things like that in the music, right? And so, that's one thing that you should certainly, certainly, certainly pay attention to. The other thing I just want to say before I close this quick video is that, after all this, like they were literally inducted in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, right? They had that much impact to the culture. And yes, they were controversial and all that, but they were also inducted in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. I'm going to attach with this video a quick the induction speech by Spike Lee and Harry Belafonte of Chuck D, Flavor Flav, and Terminator X in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. I think it was 2013 or 2011. 2011, I think. But I'm going to find that introduction by them, link that to this as well for you to see it. So hopefully that helps you out, right? I'm excited about Wednesday. Like I said, I'm a Public Enemy guy. And this is part of what I do. I really, growing up, I mean, in college at this time, that kind of mentality was going on. I was more of a, I wasn't that radical at all, but I was intrigued, right, by the courage, by the boldness of the music, right? I grew up in white schools, right? So there was no way I could speak like that, right? I came into college with a white girlfriend, right? So there's no way I could really speak like that, right? But it was just interesting to me to know that there are people like this, right? And then to hear, of course, I went to a black college, right? So now I'm hearing the music, all over the place, and then of course, we had just saw School Days, and then soon thereafter, Do the Right Thing comes out, and Do the Right Thing has, you know, some of the PE soundtrack, right? At 1989, a number, another summer, Sound of the Funky Drummer, right? And you remember the Funky Drummer? You saw that in the video that we talked about with Clyde Summerfield in the video we watched early in the semester on sampling, right? But that drum beat, right, that Public Enemy made. I'm glad I thought about that because you all heard, Clyde Summerfield talked about Public Enemy in that video from January. So all this will kind of come back home, right, as we kind of wrap up with Public Enemy and then Nas and then whatever album you're working in on. So, all right, y'all. Appreciate y'all. Just giving you a shout out on this Saturday morning, letting you know I'm thinking about you. I'm reading your Kanye West stuff right now. The Jay Z, the No Church in the Wild stuff. I just started reading that. I'm just trying to make sure I understand what I got in front of me. Been making some notes, and I'll be reading everything in between that again. I got some notes for some of you. Some of you are doing excellently. Everything is done the way I want it to be done. So some of you, I'll be sending a note, kind of looking at a pattern of what your writing has done, and giving you some suggestions as you go toward the last, you know, couple pieces of writing. All right. I appreciate you all. Be safe. Those of you who are Christian, have a phenomenal Resurrection Sunday. And everybody else, those of you who are Muslim, certainly enjoy your Ramadan. And God bless you and stay strong.